Team 1, stand by. Copy. Team 1, standing by. Breach, breach, breach.
Hey guys, welcome back. So on this show, we're going to continue with our topic of mental health and public safety. And if you remember back, if you've listened to any of them, especially at the beginning of this particular segment, we were talking about something and I explained then that we would discuss more later. Well, the reason in that is because I wanted to bring in someone who was a professional in it, someone who goes around and actually does this and helps people with mental health in public safety. And that particular topic, if you recall, was critical incident debriefing. So, and he'll explain more, but critical incident debriefing, we all put on this suit, so to speak, a suit of armor to make ourselves kind of impervious to the things that we're going to see, hear, and experience in the different aspects of our jobs. Like I said, public safety is not just fire departments and law enforcement. It's fire department, law enforcement, EMS, dispatch, corrections. Every one of us in public safety wind up experiencing these different things. We experience some of the worst things that individuals will ever go through in their life. And if you also remember back to the statistics, we were talking about the population of the U.S. just alone and the number of individuals in public safety. And you'll recall that those of us in public safety only make up 1.4% of the entire U.S. population. So out of 300 plus million people in the United States, we make up 1.4% of that. So there's 1.4% of us that are responsible for responding and helping the general population in some of the worst times of their lives. I've said it plenty of times before. We rarely see people on good days, regardless of what your job in public safety is. We often see them on the worst days of their life. And when those individuals are going through things, they're expecting someone to show up to be able to help them. Someone who doesn't seem fragile and weak or unstable. They're expecting someone who's got the answers, someone who has the solution for their problems, be it when they first dial 911, be it when the fire department shows up or law enforcement or EMS, or even in the corrections field. Those in the corrections field, they go through it as well. And whether you're someone who's currently incarcerated or whether you're someone who has a loved one that is incarcerated, you're expecting those individuals in the corrections facility to be able to do the job, protect your loved ones, protect you. So we get used to this, and the people that we serve, the general population that we serve, that's what they're looking for. So that's what we show up, and that's how we are. And we do it so much that often enough, we start to believe it. We start to believe that none of these things that we experience really affect us. That, oh, well, it's just another call. It's just another this. It's just another that. And we start to subconsciously believe it and get comfortable in the fact that this is the world we live in, that these are the things that we do and that we experience. But often enough, we forget, and while we're remembering that, we're forgetting the fact that we too are human beings. We have minds, we have hearts, we have different aspects of our lives, and these things are affecting us the same as they would anyone else. We're going through these traumatic events the same as any other individual, but we're doing it at a much higher rate. If you also remember in the statistics that we talked about, on average, your public safety employee, on average, will experience 188 critical incidents throughout their entire career. So we're talking, obviously a long career. If you only spend a few years in it, if you get 188 in just a few years, you've been a busy person. But throughout your entire career, you'll experience 188 critical incidents, just alone, one individual. And if you compare that to the general population on how much individual person will experience in their entire lifetime, unless they're doing a job similar in public safety, they're not likely to experience that level of repeated trauma, that level of depravity. They're not experiencing those things. Those of us that work in the public safety field, we are. And we have to remind ourselves, but often enough, we don't. And that's what's brought on the stigma that is mental health when it comes to public safety. And it's not just public safety. The stigma is everywhere. It's still in the general population, though it's becoming much more acceptable in the general population nowadays. In public safety, the military, in those particular areas where the employees or the individuals that are doing those jobs are expected to be, quote unquote, the superheroes, they're experiencing that stuff. And we're not doing anything about it because of a stigma. And that's what we're trying to get past here. We're trying to get past the stigma. So any of you that are watching the podcast right now, you'll see another individual on your screen. And this is the professional I was talking about. He's got 30 plus years in public safety, and he started out in Milwaukee. In 1998, he made the wise decision to move over here to the great portion of the Southeast, and has since spent the last 23 years here doing the job, working in public safety, the same as the rest of us that are here doing this job. He's one of that 1.4%. Currently holding a command staff position. This is an individual that when he and I first met, he was not in a command staff position, and he has worked his way up to where he is. So without further ado, I'd like you all to meet Captain Pete Hossalla. Pete, how are you?
Hey, Brian, I appreciate you having me on here. And I also thank you for calling me a professional on this matter here. I like to consider myself a professional more based on my life experiences than actually any type of certification that I might hold. But again, thanks for having me on here.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to sit down and help us have this conversation. I know that you and I both, even though we've worked together for quite some time now, it wasn't always that you and I shared this particular passion, or at least understood that we both shared this particular passion. For me, I wound up getting this passion from what you know of me and going through education. You know that, it kind of developed going through my college degrees, getting my education through there, but then also applying all of that to the job and what I've seen and what I've seen it do to the general population as well as to my coworkers. I never even thought to have the discussion with you, but would you mind sharing with us how this wound up becoming something that was a passion for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I worked for our agency, started on patrol, eventually worked my way into the crime scene unit. In the crime scene unit, I was exposed to many different things. A lot of traumatic incidents. I've seen children that were still locked in child's safety seats, involved in car accidents, completely thrown out of their vehicles, just laying on the side of the road. I picked people off of railroad tracks and had to fingerprint them before. And you don't realize how that stuff starts to affect you. And I think it really hit home with me when I realized that the call for service one day was coming from my own home. And I lost my 3-year-old son in a choking accident at our home. And the feeling that I had after that, and not only me, but my wife, for the first several years after that, we walked around in a complete daze, a complete realm of darkness and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Until we were approached about the sudden and traumatic loss seminars and critical incident seminars, and we're invited to attend one of them. So that's where all of my interest got piqued.
Okay. Well, I think, and I hope that I'm not touching on something a little too sensitive here, but just to kind of demonstrate how this really affects us. You and I talked about it previously before we started recording. I remember a conversation you and I had. Do you remember the conversation that I'm referring to?
I have to refresh that one because we've had so many outstanding
Okay.
conversations.
We were in particular discussing how your mindset was coping with the loss that you were experiencing. You remember it now?
I do. I do.
Okay. So just so that those of us or those that are listening to the podcast or watching it, um, Pete and I were having a closed door conversation one day. This was after he come back from leave, still obviously grieving from his loss. His family still grieving from the loss, and he wound up having a conversation with me, and he told me. And now, mind you, this is not too long after he moved from the crime scene division over to a more command staff position. And he wound up telling me that he knew that he should be feeling a different way, that he sees the way the loss is affecting his wife and that it's affecting his family. But he didn't he didn't feel exactly like they did. That he was obviously grieving. He was obviously devastated by what he and his family were going through. And correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, but you were kind of confused on why your emotions were a little bit different than the rest of your family and especially your wife. Is that correct?
You're 100% correct with that. I felt that in a way that my wife was alone in her grieving process, but I was also alone in mine.
Mhm.
Um, and I think some of that was what you touched on already with that we've got this stigma attached to us that we are supposed to be the strong ones. We're the deputies, we're the police. We put on that badge every day and we go out there and save the world, but until you realize that you can't save that world every day, especially when it hits your own house, that's when it starts to hit you. But I went my way with my grieving and I let my wife go the other way with the grieving.
Mhm.
And that just led to years of destruction for our marriage.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out the fact that one of the things that we talked about during that conversation was the fact that with you working crime scene, with everything you were exposed to, whether whether it was a child's death, whether it was a murder, whether it was a suicide, whether it was a fatal crash, um, everything that you experienced, going back to that statistic we talked about, those 188 critical incidents, everything that you experience conditions your mind to process this information vastly different than someone who was never exposed to it or has not been exposed to it, especially to the extent at the time that you were.
Yeah.
And I think that correlation, goes back to all of us. You've heard it as much as I have. Those of us that work in public safety often enough come off as crass. We come off as having a morbid sense of humor and things of that nature. But it's because we are exposed to these elements, these things that we experience so much and on such a high rate, that in my studying of it, I found that is our way of coping with it.
That's
That
exactly.
that being crass and being morbid and making the jokes to ourselves winds up being a coping mechanism for us more than anything else. And to the general population that sees that and doesn't understand the public safety subculture within our general culture, it comes off vastly different to them. However, to us, it's completely normal. It's completely normal for us to be on one of these scenes and see everyone around us crying, falling apart, and everything. And while we're talking with them and dealing with them, we're compassionate. We're showing empathy for what they're experiencing. But then we're back by ourselves. We're talking about something else, and it's because our brain compartmentalizes that information differently to help protect us, to help allow us to be able to do the job at the level that we do it. Is that something that you would agree with?
100%. I mean, like you said, we're out there showing empathy and compassion for these people, but at the same time, where's ours in return? Where do we get that from?
Mhm.
I mean, our spouses are sometimes there for us, but they don't understand the profession as well as we do, being in
Right.
it for.
Right. And speaking and specifically on that, as you know, my wife works in public safety, but she was not working in public safety when I first got into it. Matter of fact, I believe it was 3 or 4 years that I'd been on the job before she ever got into public safety. And one of the things that we oftentimes did at the end of the shift is we'd get together and shoot the breeze and talk about the different calls and share the war stories and so on and so forth. And I wouldn't, I would get off at the end of my shift and it would be 45 minutes to an hour, if not longer, before I got to the house. And she would ask me, why is it taking you so long to get, to the house? Especially when I live less than 15 minutes away from the house. She didn't understand it. And I tried to explain to her, well, I'm shooting the breeze with the guys. And that's just it. We're running our mouths, this, that, and the other. I never went into details about it. And eventually one day she cornered me, not physically, mind you, but she cornered me and she said, look, I understand you want to talk with the guys, but you're my husband. And I kind of want to see you when you come home at the end of your day. And I thought what I was doing was protecting her. She didn't work in public safety and I didn't want to bring that home to her. I didn't want to bring home everything that I was seeing and experiencing and hearing and everything like that. I didn't want to bring it home to her. I didn't want to bring it home to my kids. So I was doing that with the guys and essentially shutting her off and closing her off out of that portion of my life, thinking, innocently enough, that I was just protecting her. And then there was the side note of it in that I didn't think she would get it. I didn't think she would understand. And in essence, I was right in that because it wasn't until she started in public safety herself that she really, truly understood it. And it's not one of those things where you just wake up and be like, oh, I get it now. It's when she's having a conversation with someone who's not doing the job and they give her that kind of that side look like, oh, why? That's a little dark. Why'd you go there? And that's when she really kind of started to understand. Like she understood a lot, but that was when she really started to understand that the general population doesn't understand what we go through and what we do. And like you and I spoke and talking about the stigma, we wind up doing that to ourselves. And the research I was doing before we came on today to do this show, there was an old Police One article I was reading that actually called it, I think they called it tailgating or the choir meeting, which was something what we were doing, that we were having a choir meeting according to this article, which was just us sitting around and shooting the breeze. And just like I talked in one of the previous episodes, back, I'd say probably the 80s, it wasn't uncommon for someone to get off shift and have a couple of beers in the parking lot or go to a local watering hole and have a couple of beers there before going to the house. And, we talked about this just the other day. You can't do that no more. Like when you get off duty, especially if you're still in uniform, before you go do anything like that, your butt's at the house. Otherwise, your butt's at the house permanently. So, that's one of the things that we used to do. But now, because of the stigma and because of, obvious legal and ethical reasons, we don't do the choir meetings per se. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us when we're experiencing on average 188 critical incidents in our lifetime, in our career? Where does that leave us on dealing with everything? We've got this stigma on us. So we talk about it with each other, but even in the conversations you and I've had, while we've had a lot of conversations and we've talked quite a bit about different things, it hadn't been, but over the last several years that you and I really started to kind of meld and get that conversation with what we were seeing and what we were going through and things like that. And with everything going on and us trying to break through that stigma, I think that's what's got us to where we are, especially with all the research and doing these critical incidents. So in what is it in particular that you do? Because like I said, you're the professional here. when it comes to this particular aspect. What is it that critical incident debriefing is about? Kind of lead us into that and help us with that some.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can touch on one thing that we were talking about as far as your spouse and everything else
Yeah.
too. Um, whether it's going home and listening to some music on your way home to chill out, stopping in your driveway, collecting yourself for 5 or 10 minutes or something before you go inside.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have discussed before that, your spouses or significant other ones are a significant part of the support system for this.
100%.
To keep communication open with your spouse in matters with this is extremely important. And one thing that I just recently learned that kind of stuck with me was, if you set it up with your wife where you have a PG or an X-rated conversation, not X-rated in any type of other way,
Mm-hmm.
If you guys come up with the understanding as to a PG conversation as to, hey, I had a pretty good day, some guy died of natural causes, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Or if she wants to know the details, and that would be something that you and your wife would have to determine,
Mm-hmm.
So get that set up as to what type of conversation you guys are interested in having first, if you want that PG or that X-rated one.
Right.
That would get your wife or your spouse engaged in conversation too.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So you want me to talk about the debriefing process now?
Yeah, let's kind of jump into that. Kind of tell us, well, first off, what would you say would classify as critical incidents?
Okay. We use two different terms for any type of incidents like this regarding debriefings. We use a traumatic experience, and we also use a critical incident. A lot of the critical incidences could be something from an officer-involved shooting or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a traumatic event would be any type of a normal call that you may go on, which may be the death of a child or some other traumatic event that happened in your everyday,
Mm-hmm.
besides an officer involved type shooting thing. So that's the terminology we like to use for that.
Okay, so traumatic would be a call for service, so to speak, in which you were responding to, say, a suicide or a child death or something along those lines, and the critical incident would be such as an officer involved shooting. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay.
So our job with the critical incidents, the first seminar that I actually attended, I attended with my wife after our traumatic event happened,
Mm-hmm.
and sudden and traumatic loss syndrome, or sudden traumatic loss. And we absolutely loved it. We got a lot of stuff out of it. And the purpose of those things is they go through and they give you the tools that you can use that will hopefully help you to get through these things.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, it is really up to the person, because if I'm given all of the tools and I do not apply them, then these things are not going to work for you.
Right.
Of the incident debriefings that I have performed, just something interesting, out of the 188 critical incidences that you've talked about in somebody's career over 30 years that I've had, I've never been involved in one of them in that aspect, as far as debriefing and telling how I felt about any of that stuff.
Okay.
So this is all a newer thing for us. I've been certified now for almost 4 years in the process. I think that one of the major things with a critical incident debriefing is we want the guys that are involved in these incidents to know that they're not the only ones. They're not alone. And there's other people that have been through this stuff, and we're here for them for that.
Right.
So we get them all together, and the first thing we do is go over some ground rules, how everything that we discuss is confidential. We're not taking notes. We're not doing this. Turn your phones off and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll go around the room and ask them one at a time, and everybody is encouraged to attend or encouraged to speak,
Mm-hmm.
but also pass and speak when they're ready. Something along the lines of the first one would be like, what was your involvement in the call? And after everybody shares what their involvement was with it, the second one would be something as far as, what was a traumatic thing that stuck out with you during the event and everything like that. And then after that, we use a term called autopilot, because we all go into autopilot where we know that we got a job to do. But once you come back down and get out of that police mode again and come back into normal Brian or Pete mode, and come back into some sense of reality, we want to know what you're thinking about the incident then. You may be having some type of a trigger during this event. If it's somebody's face that you're seeing, if you're seeing the blood on your hands, if you're seeing you're ripping your shirt or something like that, that's the type of stuff that we want to know.
Right.
After we discuss all of that type of stuff, we get into the health and wellness section of it, where there are different things that you can look for. If you start turning to alcohol, if you can't sleep, if it's pills, if you get irritated, all kinds of different things like that aren't normal associations with your personality. We go over a series of those that you may look for in something like that. And then also some things that you can do to help out. You may feel distraught or withdrawn through an incident like this. But in turn, you can use that for a good thing. If you're a little withdrawn from people, you can use that as a time in your life to reflect,
Right.
What kind of people you want in your life, what you want your life to be and everything. So you can still use some of that as a positive type of thing. And, after we're done with the teaching part of it, we like to bring it all back together. And we'll come in and we'll ask, is there something that you got out of this debriefing that you feel is going to stick with you? Because we're all giving one little piece of that puzzle. And hopefully your piece of that puzzle may help at least one other person that's involved in the debriefing.
Yeah.
And then I think part two is reading the room, seeing who might need a little bit more afterwards, and then following up with them after a debriefing at another time too.
Right. Okay. So like you, obviously I don't have quite the long and illustrious career. I'm probably about 50% of the way of where you are. I've got 17 years in now. And what's that?
That's because I'm a lot older.
Yeah. I don't know about a lot older, but you started in 92, 93. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't jump into the game until 06. So you had a little bit of a head start on me. So being that I've been in this profession for as long as I have, like you, it wasn't until a few years ago that I actually experienced I guess it would be a traumatic experience debriefing. And I believe you were there when we had this one. As you know, especially with having a focus on mental health, I've gone through several different things. We talked about these the other day, the double homicide that I was privy to. I was one of the first responding units with the rest of my shift to that particular double homicide. And a quick experience in that was that, we got there, we handled business, talking about autopilot, we got there and we handled business. We did our jobs, navigated all the different areas that we needed to get through in order to get the one survivor that was still alive safely away into medical help, and then to, process the scene, get everybody there to help process the scene. That entire time, I was standing around, I was completely fine. I'd seen dead bodies, I had seen shootings. So those things weren't really affecting me. And I remember in specific, we had a coworker that was there with us. And this particular coworker was going through field training at the time. And he was kind of standing there and he just kind of had this bewildered look on his face, and walked up and spoke with him. And I was like, "Hey man, you good? You all right? What's going on?" It's like, I kind of feel like we should be talking to somebody right now. I'm like, "What? What do you mean you should be talking to somebody? Like, I mean, we're going to be talking to investigators and all of that. What in particular are you talking about? I mean, with everything we just seen and we went through, I just kind of felt like we should be talking to somebody. And even I think then I was either just getting started into my education in mental health, but even then, I was like, what do you mean talking to somebody? Like, we don't talk to anybody. This is fine. And
Right.
I had talked previously, um, uh, people like yourselves who have been in the work for this long, and even me at 17 years, we think back in the earlier days of our careers and talk about those things, that it wasn't an issue. So when he brought this up to me, I was falling susceptible to the same thing. I'm looking at him. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean we need to talk to somebody? And then it dawned on me, okay, like this is affecting him. And at the time, a couple of our chaplains were there. And I walked over and I said, hey, you mind walking over and speaking with us? And because we try to do things as a group, because we need to rely on one another, I got the sergeant at the time and the rest of the shift. I say, y'all come over here and let's have a chat real quick. So we sat there and we talked with the chaplain, and it wasn't as structured as the debriefings that you're referring to now, because I don't think then, it was well before 2016. So obviously there probably wasn't as much information out there, and the research wasn't out there probably, but we kind of had our own little debriefing while we were still there on the scene outside the crime scene tape with the chaplain, where we sat there and talked about, what we went through, what we experienced, what we saw. And of course, all of us were macho men. So we were like, I mean, I'm fine. I didn't feel anything. Well, it wasn't until weeks later where it finally dawned on me that, there was something going on. And like I explained to you the other day, I'm a right-handed person. I don't know what this guy's over here doing most of the time. Like, I can't write with it. It's pretty much useless unless I need to hold a cup or something. But my right hand is my dominant hand. So I do everything with that. Draw my gun, drink, eat, operate a doorknob, shift gears in a manual. I know a lot of people can't do that nowadays. But my right hand is my go-to. Well, I'm sitting here, I'm leaving out to go to work one morning. We start and shift, and it's at the time I definitely showed up way earlier than my shift started. And, only light that's outside is the street light that's behind my back. And at the time, there was no information on who the offender was in this double homicide. Now, this is weeks later, and I've been fine. Well, I'm sitting here jostling my keys. I'm trying to lock the deadbolt on my house, and I'm jostling my keys, and I'm like, why is this so difficult? I do this every day. Why is this so difficult for me to operate my keys? And so I put the key into the deadbolt, and it was then when I realized I was using my left hand. And I'm like, well, this is odd. Why am I using my left hand? I never use my left hand for anything. And then I tried to pay attention, or I made sure to pay attention where my right hand was. My right hand was resting on my gun. And I was sitting there, I'm like, what in the world? Why? And it was odd because it wasn't dawning on me at the time why I'm doing something with my left hand, but yet my hand is on my gun. And it wasn't just like resting, like, where I'll put her elbow down on it. It was grasped. It was ready to hit the safeties and draw if I need to. And in those brief moments, it dawned on me that the reason why I was doing this is because my brain, from not knowing who killed these individuals, my brain is still switched on into high gear. Like, we need to be ready because we don't know who this person is or if they're going to try to get us.
Yeah.
And my brain, that's when I was like, okay, obviously this is affecting me. Now, I didn't go talk to anybody other than, hey, you'll never guess what happened to me. And kind of in a joking manner. And I think that's a coping mechanism for us as well. We kind of joke about it with our coworkers to kind of feel them out and see how they're going to take it. That way, if they don't take it well and start making fun, you're like, I know, man, and then you kind of go on, lick your wounds and move on. So that was my first experience with really realizing that, there were things happening to me mentally that I wasn't in control of. My outward expressions and how I generally felt was completely okay. It wasn't bothering me at all. And my conscious thought of not knowing who is the individual that was responsible for these deaths. But subconsciously, my brain's like, hey, look, you know what? I got us back here. Since you don't want to do it, I got us. And so my hand was on my gun. Hey, guys, got to jump in here real quick. I hope you're enjoying the content. However, we have reached the end of this particular part, and we'll pick it back up on the next one. Thanks for joining me. See you on the next one. Bye.